Chapter 5. Propaganda Technique. The word propaganda has come to have a sinister connotation. Yet we have always had the thing itself more or less with us. The Collegium de Propaganda Fide is the official title of the Board of Missions of the Catholic Church. In a political sense, propaganda is the process of creating public opinion, and it is doubtful whether anyone who shies at the word would be willing to give up his democratic right of trying to change his neighbor's vote. There is a certain justification, nevertheless, for the apprehension usually aroused when propaganda is suspected. The aim of propaganda is not to clarify a situation. It differs in this respect from the give and take of open discussion. It is all give and no take. A speech in the Senate, for example, is not propaganda. It may be answered, and the ensuing debate proceeds on the assumption of the possibility of compromise. In the case of propaganda, the conversion of the propagandist is out of the question from the start. His aim being nothing less than action along the lines he has mapped out. There is a well-grounded suspicion in the minds of those upon whom he confers his attention that any method that brings results is acceptable to him. It is not my reason that interests him, but my vote. The widespread belief in the automatic evolution of society notwithstanding, there is always discernible amid the dust and smoke that hang over the inauguration of great social changes, the figure of a man, or a small group of men, devoting themselves to the task of keeping the fires of agitation blazing. Propagandists, in short. The grand incendiary of the provinces, as Governor Hutchinson called Samuel Adams, had carried on his agitation against Great Britain for nearly 20 years before the outbreak of the war, and as early as 1768 had resolved in his own mind upon independence. In the anti-slavery movement, Garrison had begun to print his Liberator as far back as 1831 and never paused in his efforts until the slaves were free. In the great reform agitations in England during the 19th century, we find similar restless spirits. Cobden working for repeal of the Corn Laws, O'Connor fanning the flames of Chartism into fury. In France, we see Robespierre and a small group of journalists directing the apparently chaotic forces that produced the terror. Another group of journalists headed by Lenin have put Bolshevism in the place of Tsarism. Propaganda is feeble and ineffectual unless it fashions for itself an organization. An organization endows an idea with a degree of prestige which it can never obtain from the advocacy of scattered individuals. De Tocqueville thought he was discovering an American peculiarity when he noted the great number of organizations for all conceivable purposes. If the Bostonians were threatened with smallpox, they formed an anti-smallpox society, he said. It is the club with which non-official statesmen compel the official chiefs to make innovations in public policy. Cobden used the Anti-Corn Law League in his 7-year propaganda for free trade. It brought into play, his opponents charged, quote, all the approved means of poisoning the stream of public sentiment, end quote. Tracts, newspapers, lectures, conferences of dissenting clergymen, tea parties given with the cooperation of the ladies, bazaars, mass meetings, and petitions to Parliament. Catholic emancipation was forced by the Catholic Association, the organization of Irishmen under their clergy, led by Daniel O'Connell. Chartism was sent on its wild career by the London Working Men's Association. In a month after the founding of the parent organization, 100 branches had sprung up in various parts of the country, fostered by missionaries from London, and 3 years later, a petition in favor of the charter was presented to the House of Commons, signed by over 1 million persons. It was the Anti-Slavery Society, organized by Garrison in 1832, that created an opposition to slavery powerful enough to force the professional politicians to admit the question into practical politics. 10 years before the beginning of the War for Independence, we find the Sons of Liberty active in Boston, composed mainly of mechanics and laborers, who held secret meetings and were the prime movers, under the guidance of Samuel Adams and his friends, in every public demonstration against the British government. Other towns followed Boston's example. The famous committees of correspondence followed later, and they had much propaganda to do. For revolutions, as a noted Englishman has observed, are the work of energetic minorities who succeed in committing majorities to measures for which they at first have little inclination. John Adams was of the opinion that about 1/3 of the people of the colonies were opposed to the revolution. A much larger proportion was indifferent. The chief medium of propaganda is naturally language, but in these days print, for several reasons, takes the lead of oral speech. Print lends itself to infinite multiplication. There is something, too, in the nature of cold print that makes it a peculiarly dangerous weapon of propaganda. No matter how incredulously you may stare at it, you cannot browbeat print into telling a different story. This immobility is, to the average mind, of the very essence of truth. The masters of propaganda have well understood its value from the days when Cromwell smashed all the royalist presses and whipped the women caught selling contraband royalist journals, to the era of Bolshevism. Modern propaganda is helpless without the printing press. In quote, before 1789, there had been 2 or 3 newspapers in Paris. Suddenly the floodgates were opened, and Paris was deluged with journals. The booksellers' shops were crowded from morning to night. The price of printing was doubled. One collector is reported to have accumulated 2,500 different political pamphlets in the last few months of 1788, and to have stopped in despair at the impossibility of completing his collection. Arthur Young writes in his diary on June 9, 1789, 13 came out today, 16 yesterday, and 92 last week. The Anti-Saloon League, which added the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, published 32 monthlies and 4 weeklies. The Nonpartisan League of the Northwest had an official paper in every county in North Dakota. In the preparatory period of the American Revolution, the Boston Gazette and the Worcester Spy pounded away year after year. Samuel Adams, the penman of the Revolution, wrote under some 20-odd noms de plume. Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer swept the colonies like wildfire. The committees of correspondence kept up a rain of broadsides, letters, and pamphlets. The abolitionists, too, early learned how much paper could be covered with printer's ink at a small expense. Witness the Liberator, the Genius of Universal Emancipation, the Abolitionist, the annual anti-slavery almanacs with woodcuts of floggings and kidnappings of Negroes. That tremendous piece of propaganda, Uncle Tom's Cabin, set millions of people weeping over the cruelty and pathos of the slave's condition, and through its effect upon the young, especially, gave the Republican Party of 1860 a harvest of first voters who had been subjected to its spell. It is in the news they carry, rather than in their editorial comment, that the propagandistic power of the newspapers lies. This has suggested to certain reformers like W.J. Bryan the advisability of government ownership of the news distributing industry. Great newspapers are under the influence of the financial interests. Let us, therefore, have newspapers published by the government, which all can trust. Governments, that is, administrations, would no doubt welcome such an arrangement with open arms. Governments in power have as much need of a supporting public opinion as their opponents have of undermining that support. It is not difficult to imagine the absoluteness of a despotism that had the sources of news in its control. When the Bolshevists published a dispatch that the whole world was on the point of adopting a Soviet form of government, no Russian had the hardihood to condemn Bolshevism. Bismarck long ago taught Europe what could be done in this field. But in America, the idea of an official press seems out of place. Yet governmental manipulation is not entirely unknown, or at any rate not unsuspected, even here. The combined outcry of the American press for the war with Spain is attributed by a writer like Gamaliel Bradford to the need of the Republican administration of 1898, which had made a failure of its domestic policies of getting a victorious war to its credit. Direct control of the press in that instance is not implied. There are subtler ways. No newspaper, said E.L. Godkin, then editor of the New York Evening Post, would stir up a war, but with a few honorable exceptions. If it saw preparations making for a fight, the press would be inclined to encourage the combatants. During the Spanish-American War, 2 newspapers were reported to have reached a circulation of over 1 million, and some that had found it difficult to make a living in peacetime made a fortune. The recent war taught us fresh ways of handling news as propaganda. Picture and film, in the opinion of Ludendorff, one of the greatest experts, make a deeper impression and a more compact one than the written word, and therefore have a greater influence on the masses. Those who cannot read can understand pictures. The more obscure technique of faking a picture, as compared with that of printing a false dispatch, makes the propaganda motive harder to detect and all the more effective. Radio as a propaganda instrument undoubtedly has a great future. Already we have a broadcasting station on top of the New York Municipal Building so that the city fathers may tell the people the truth concerning their government. Presidential candidates in the last campaign spoke to 10 million listeners scattered over the entire continent instead of to 2,000 or 3,000 in a hall. Print is powerless to create the enthusiasm that a good orator may arouse in his immediate audience. The prohibitionists, the abolitionists, the Bolsheviki, the Corn Leaguers, the Chartists, the Jacobins kept their orators continually in action. There was not a single evening for 18 months, it is said, on which Robespierre did not make at least one speech, and that never a short one, to the mobs that crowded the meetings of the Jacobins in the Church of the Capuchins in Paris. New occasions call for new forms of propaganda. British suffragettes before the war discovered carefully regulated violence. Hunger striking, to be sure, is a double-edged weapon that requires nice judgment in handling, as it depends upon an accurate estimation of the psychology of the men in power. The British women, as it turned out, were correct in their diagnosis, but the same weapon in other hands, in those of alien communists at Ellis Island, has not given such good results. It is applicable only when used by members of the same class against each other, or by women against men of their own class. Real violence, less regulated than the careful window smashing and incendiarism of the British ladies, has been found valuable to both sides in industrial disputes. If the police shoot down workmen, that is propaganda for the cause of labor. If workmen riot and destroy property, it is propaganda for the employers. A little roughness on the part of the police, consequently, is not objectionable to labor leaders. It helps. Employers on their side have been known to engage men to damage their property. It gives them a grievance. The object of each party to the dispute is to get the neutral public to come on its side. The most ambitious of the uses of propaganda has been credited to the Germans. The Germans were accused of propaganda through economic, educational, and diplomatic channels. With the outbreak of the war, propaganda became an important arm of their military organization, with the triple aim of winning the support of neutrals, breaking down enemy morale, and strengthening morale at home. The system was perfect, but somehow it broke down in operation. They miscalculated the trajectory of their propaganda, misjudged the incidence of violence. How their initial onset terrified the small neutrals, but aroused in the strong ones a sense of danger and the will to resist. How Belgian atrocities and submarine sinkings proved fatal in bringing the most powerful of all the neutrals against them has become a world fable. Yet it is one of the strangest ironies of the war that while propaganda, for military purposes, was generally regarded in the countries of the Allies as a treacherous German invention, the Germans themselves attributed their downfall to the superiority of the propaganda of the Allies. It was not military superiority that overcame us, laments Ludendorff. We gazed at the enemy propaganda like the rabbit at the snake. The Vossische Zeitung cries out, "Max, we try to shut our country off from enemy espionage and from the work of agents and rascals, but with open eyes we leave it defenseless, while a stream of poisonous speeches pours over our people." And Herr Hexler, "Max, time presses. Just as the enemy has learned many things from us during the war, so we ought not to shrink from going to the enemy's school if his teachings and his methods have stood the test. I repeat what I have said for years, that Reuter and the English news propaganda are mightier than the English fleet and more dangerous than the English army. The English news propaganda was in the hands of Lord Northcliffe, which is perhaps sufficient guarantee of its excellence. Max." Ludendorff confirms George Creel's boast that American propaganda, advertising the colossal military effort of this country, contributed materially toward the breaking of German morale. The general acquired an unwholesome respect for American publicity work. It had got on his nerves. He notes as propaganda material used by the Allies references to Prussian militarism, the Kaiser, the Crown Prince, Ludendorff himself, the League of Nations, a peace of understanding, national self-determination, social revolution, Belgian cruelties, abuse of prisoners, democracy versus aristocracy. The Allies could not open their mouths without uttering propaganda. President Wilson's notes and speeches especially crumpled them up behind the lines. The Allies sent their propaganda over with rifle grenades that scattered pamphlets and leaflets, with 75 shell 6-inch guns, rockets, and still more directly by wireless, shouting over the earth for all to hear. The perfection of the German propaganda outfit at the beginning of the war developed an antitoxin which later became an immunizing suspicion against their good and bad intentions alike. When they begged for peace, they were charged with propaganda. Their revolution was propaganda, and even though they killed one another in civil strife, we were warned, especially from Paris, against propaganda. The same immunizing suspicion is in danger of being overworked in other fields. When a labor organization makes unpleasant demands, or tenants agitate for restrictions upon rent profiteering, someone arises to remind us of propaganda aimed at all our most cherished institutions. The mayor of New York not long ago remarked that the action of the public school teachers to arouse sentiment in favor of higher salaries for themselves was nothing but propaganda. The word propaganda itself, like other catchwords and slogans, Bolshevism, Prussianism, 6 to 16 to 1, remember the Maine, etc., has become a powerful propaganda missile. Whenever possible, propaganda makes use of the principles of mob psychology, for which the best opportunities exist in cities, but it should not be forgotten that crowds may be crowds just as truly, though they be invisible and dispersed, especially under the conditions of modern rapid communication. Crowds are subject to mass contagion and stampede. The uninitiated take the applause of a clock for the sentiment of the whole audience, and all but the most independent characters join in. On the political stage, the part of the clock is played by mass meetings, demonstrations, and processions. Rhythm and dazzle render a crowd more suggestible, hence the use in political campaigns of mass singing, band music, torchlight processions, fireworks, and bunting. A presidential campaign is a double, sometimes triple, propaganda on the largest known scale. The development of the art of propaganda has given us a new profession. Its members used to be known commonly as press agents. The press agent became a publicity man. His latest appellation is Counsel on Public Relations. Propaganda is his trade. Of necessity, he does not seek personal notoriety, for the success of his work depends upon the ignorance of large numbers of people of his methods. He might be called the mob artist. Man in bulk, the crowd, is the material he works with. Give him the tools of his trade, chiefly printer's ink and paper, and he will turn you out any sort of crowd you desire. It will shout for war or peace, Bolshevism or Tsarism as he dictates. At his command it will adore Wagner, Russian violinists, mahjong, crossword puzzles. He is the deus ex machina of drives, nominations, selling campaigns, and Billy Sunday revivals. He is the ventilator of ideas, the organizer of public opinion, the instigator of action. Without him, progress would halt, and modern civilization sink into a parochial dullness. He is the leaven of the lump. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that democracy, as we know it, is under the dictatorship of the mob artist. Our only salvation is to keep the profession open to competition. Chapter 6. The Higgling of the Market. One of the many textbooks on the science of selling is entitled Making Him Buy. We have yet to hear of a book on making him sell. For the most part, business is a drive of sellers against buyers, a more or less organized offensive against an undisciplined mob. Sellers are the aggressive agents, and salesmanship may be defined as the art of making those buy who would not have bought if let alone. The fact that salesmanship is a subtle form of compulsion is evident in the maxims and admonitions handed out to novices by the adepts. Don't give up at anything short of a knockout, is the advice of one, but that given, shake hands with the victor good-naturedly and then proceed to lay plans for another interview. And again, never make it easy for a prospect to turn you down or out. If he is going to do these things, make him work hard to do it. The business of the salesman is to break down sales resistance. What prevents the prospect from turning the salesman down and out, as 9 times out of 10 he feels inclined to do? The reason appears under various disguises in every selling code. There is something like a tribal taboo protecting the salesman. He is safe as long as he keeps to the forms of conventional politeness. The prospect cannot get rid of him without violating that ritual. This is the meaning of the emphasis laid by the professors of the art upon such items as poise, restraint, self-respect, courage, authority, a good front, the very best approach, and always personality. The prospect who would gladly turn his back upon the selling artist or bid him begone is prevented by these gossamer threads spun by the salesman. He must listen. Nerve, of all the virtues, is undoubtedly the one that is most indispensable to a salesman. But holding the prospect's attention is not sufficient. He must be galvanized into activity. Technically speaking, the prospect's interest has to be awakened. That is to say, some lively instinct in him must be set in motion. Now, the relative strength of the various instincts with which men are equipped varies in different individuals. Buyers who will in turn become sellers need only be shown one thing. If you do nothing but say, "It will save you money 7 times, you have made a good approach," remarks a seller sage. With the ultimate consumer, the salesman's task is not so simple. A few decades ago, it would have been said that the salesman's business was to find out the prospect's ruling idea and to operate upon that. Today, it seems more natural to speak of suppressed wishes and of complexes. In a rough way, and so far as his purpose is served, the salesman must be a psychoanalyst. Expertness therein is his open sesame to fortune. Even though he has aroused interest and desire in his prospect, the crucial moment is still to come. This is the moment when he compels the prospect to sign on the dotted line, the technique of eliciting this act. The goal of all business endeavors is varied. It depends upon the specific talents of the salesman. Some have been known to drop their fountain pen, which the polite prospect unwittingly picks up, receiving the suggestion to write through the tactile sense, assisted by the salesman's courteous but firm indication of the dotted line. Again, at the other extreme, the salesman may, his monitors tell him, exhibit a spirit akin to that of the earnest worker at a revival meeting, lay his hand upon the prospect's arm and impress upon him the urgent need of his doing this thing for his own good. But now mark something of the utmost significance. Once the signature is written, the order given, the salesman, all authorities agree, must immediately depart and not show himself again before the goods have been delivered. He must accept no invitations to lunch or the theater. If he is in a small town, he should take the earliest train out, lest he run into his customer by accident. In brief, we have here universal recognition of the fact that the prospect was brought to the dotted line under a spell woven by the salesman. It might be called the spell of the selling right. 9 out of 10 buyers emerging from that spell would cancel their orders if they could do so gracefully. The sagacious salesman does not show them the way. At his best, the salesman works under certain inescapable limitations. If, in spite of all his science, he is forbidden access to his prospect, that ends the matter. He cannot force his way in. If he fails to get an order, as is the case more often than not, he is debarred from coming again the next day. These limitations do not exist for the impersonal salesmanship of advertising. Print repeats incessantly and cannot be contradicted or dismissed. It pursues a man into the inner recesses of his home or office. It thrusts itself between him and the sky, intercepts him as he tracks his fiction amidst the columns of his magazine, dazzles him with moving lights, and shouts at him with letters mountain high. It cannot be silenced or avoided. In time, one's resistance wears down. One observes the multitude paying attention, being amused, doing as it is bidden. Finally, the advertisement becomes a tradition, part of the popular mythology. A theater audience is as much in the cast as the players. The advertisement likewise draws a great part of its power from the very crowd it is designed to influence. The costly electric sign on Broadway acquires prestige from the mere fact that it is read night after night by tens of thousands. Its bold eminence carries in itself an implication of approval by the perusing multitude. These again accept it as part of their city architecture and assist in making good the advertisement's assumption. A similar suggestibility emanates from the fact of ubiquity. The omnipresent advertisement comes to seem not the effort of an interested vendor, but an integral part of the country's and the city's landscape. Conspicuousness and repetition, the loud and incessant association of the thing vended with a real need, until nobody can feel the need without thinking of that particular way of meeting it. Here we have the secret of the power of the advertisement over men's minds. The rest of the advertising art is concerned mainly with the technique of utterance. One should carefully avoid, for example, being feeble, unintelligible, or repulsive in the choice of phraseology, style of print, or illustrative coloring. The northeast and the southwest corners of the printed page have their several and specific pulling values. One should address oneself to lively and dynamic instincts directly. Offer a vision of gastronomic rapture on the countenance of a person consuming shredded wheat with highly colored fruit and cream, rather than a table giving the food value of the dish in calories. In the drive of sellers against buyers that we have sketched, price is assumed to be fixed and unalterable. There is another phase of business in which the determination of price is the paramount issue. It is the operation referred to specifically as the higgling of the market. Let us observe for a moment what takes place in a typical higgling bout when a skillful buyer undertakes to make a purchase of an equally skillful merchant. We shall borrow the description of such a contest from an article on shopping in Italy by Louise Hale. The most dignified method of procedure is to lay aside all that one would like to buy, calmly figure what it will cost, and ask the dealer his lowest price on the lot. He will immediately take off a few francs, whereupon the customer, as graciously as before, offers to pay something less than 2/3 of the sum total. With a sad shake of the head, she will be assured that it cannot be under, and off come a few more francs. At this point, it is well for the buyer to put on her gloves, slowly but decidedly, and tell the thrifty knave that she could not pay more than 2/3 the original price, and that she is very sorry to have troubled him. Before she leaves the shop, he will have been persuaded that the time for higgling is past, and the moment for taking advantage of the present opportunity has arrived. The chances are that the goods will be in her hands and old feuds forgotten. Obviously, a battle has been waged between buyer and seller. What were the weapons employed? They were enticement, dissimulation, and intimidation. The buyer conceals her eagerness to possess the goods, the dealer his need of cash. "If you want a thing," said G.B. Shaw to William Morris, "you always get the worst of the bargain." Each seeks to frighten the other with the threat of breaking off negotiations. As in the old-time American horse trade, in which it was as important to judge human nature as to judge horses, much depends upon bluff. The similarity between the higgling of the market and the game of poker is striking. In higgling, as in poker, facial expression, voice, gesture are used to mislead one's opponent, to get him to bid high in the hope of a great victory, or to frighten him into premature surrender through ignorance of his opponent's weak hand. And, just as in an honest game of poker, there are no mirrors behind the players, so in a case of genuine bargaining, it is assumed that neither party has any advantage over the other in knowledge of his necessities or intentions. In a market where many traders meet, at a county fair for example, the conditions of the game are more complex. Each man in such a market has not only to watch those to whom he would sell or from whom he would buy, but those who are on the same side of the market with himself. If he is a buyer, he has competing buyers, and if a seller, competing sellers. The higgling between buyers and sellers is now interfered with by other buyers and sellers. Each man has to guess not only the eagerness or nervousness of his opposites, but also the probable action of his similars. One gets an odd notion from the writings of economists of what happens in a market where prices are made. One reads of the market price being ground out as if by a sort of mechanical pressure between buyers and sellers. An eminent economist writes, "In no instance where there is perfect competition can there be more than one price for the same thing at the same time." What does this mean? Only that when things are sold at a price, that is the price they are sold at, Moreover, perfect competition does not exist. There is not time for every trader to know what every other trader is doing in order to compete with him when trading becomes brisk. Transactions take place at different prices between traders only a few feet apart, even in a market as nearly perfect as the New York Stock Exchange. Every trader knows that there is for him no market price. There was a price, but that is past. What the price will be the next minute when he offers to buy or sell, he does not know. That is still to be determined by the higgling between him and some unknown trader. A government bond may have been sold a minute ago at 100. That does not mean that you can get 100 for your bond. The next deal may have to be made at 99 or at 101. Every change of a fraction in the price indicates the passage of a separate and individual higgling bout. There is no market price, there only was. Higgling on the big exchanges is obviously of a different character from that which takes place at a county fair or at an oriental bazaar. The majority of the bargainers do not see each other, but are scattered over continents or over the whole world. They act through brokers. Higgling is conducted not to any great extent by means of voice, expression, and gesture, but by rumor, print, and the stimulation of mass buying and selling. Since most of the trading on the exchange is done with borrowed capital, on margin, the speculators who engage in it are peculiarly sensitive to suggestion. One might say that their susceptibility to hope or fear was roughly in proportion to the smallness of their margins. The trader on a small margin is never quite free from the fear of being wiped out. On the other hand, having the chance of gaining, say, 10 times as much as he would have had by limiting himself to his own capital, he may be so much the more easily inflamed with speculative mania. It is the business of market operators to take advantage of this sensitiveness of the speculative mind. The method chiefly employed is that which every street corner faker knows who has an accomplice or two to start the buying. Nothing induces buying like the sight of buying, and nothing induces selling like the sight of selling. It is a familiar Wall Street maxim that you cannot induce the public to buy by proving that securities are cheap. The public buys when prices have risen. It sells when prices have fallen. It refuses to touch a stock that can be bought at a low price, but grasps wildly at upward soaring shares and sends them still higher. Market operators therefore endeavor to create an appearance of great trading activity. A Senate investigating committee has described the mechanism by which this is effected. When a banker or broker wants to create an appearance of activity in a stock, he gives at the same time to a number of different brokers orders day by day and sometimes hour by hour to sell the security on a scale, up or down according to whether he wishes to raise or lower the price. He gives at the same time to another set of brokers orders to buy on a scale. The effect is to give a great appearance of activity, although the operator has neither more nor less of the stock than before. Activity alone, however, does not suffice. It must be rationalized. Clouds of reasons appear in dope sheets, brokers' letters, the financial columns of the big dailies, and rumors emanating from well-informed quarters. Real news can be created when desired. An increase in the dividend rate of American Telegraph and Telephone, for example, was made in the spring of 1921 for the avowed purpose of furnishing a better basis for future financing. The contrary operation of depressing a stock by omitting a dividend, with the less reputable motive of buying it in at the lower level, is also well known. The most common method of influencing speculative prices is that of combining artful activity with real news. A striking illustration was offered by the armistice market of November 1918. For a month before the armistice, the stock market had been rising. The combined average closing prices of 50 stocks charted by the New York Times on September 28th, October 11, October 28th, and November 9 were 72.51, 73.36, 77.19, and 79.17 respectively. The market was discounting the armistice. In other words, prices were going higher in anticipation of the blessings sure to follow upon the restoration of peace. The morning of the armistice, prices rose more violently than ever, and upon the official announcement of the truce, the exchange was closed because the rush to buy stocks had become unmanageable. The next day, prices opened at about the previous day's closing figures, hung there a while, and then began to decline. The downward tendency continued for 3 months. The average closing prices of the same stocks on November 12th and 30, December 28, and February 1st were 78.01, 73.80, 72.860, and 71.01 respectively. Are we to assume that the crowds of speculators who had been crazy to buy stocks at any price on November 11 suddenly changed their minds the moment peace had become a reality instead of only a hope, and became just as crazy to sell? Or were there cool heads behind the scenes, equipped with knowledge rather than guesses, who simply helped, with the apparatus at their command, the mob to excite itself, themselves selling while the selling was good and staying out as the wave receded? Another instance. There were 3 distinct movements in stock market prices from the beginning of 1923 to February 1924. First, an upward swing from January to April, then a downward movement lasting until late in October. Finally, an upward movement which extended into 1924, ending on February 15th. Comment of financial writers at the time of these sudden reversals is illuminating. In its issue of November 5th, 1923, the analyst remarks, "The declaration of an extra dividend of 0.25% by the U.S. Steel Corporation and the announcement by Jesse L. Livermore, one of the largest operators in the street, that first-class stocks bought at this level should show good profits, served unexpectedly as propelling factors to push the stock market out of the rut of inaction last week. These developments occurred on the same day, Wednesday, and had the effect of starting more or less hasty short covering in all sections of the stock exchange list." The announcement of Mr. Livermore's market attitude was apparently as influential as the declaration of an extra dividend by the Steel Corporation. The upward movement continued unbroken for over 3 months, until February 15, 1924. In its issue of February 18, 1924, the analyst says of the collapse of prices which had taken place a few days before, "The oil scandal uncovered at Washington, the impending government investigation into petroleum prices, and the shock from these sources to oil stocks generally, were given in Wall Street as main causes of the break. But in truth, quite as much influence appears to have been exerted by the switching of one of the most important operators in the market from the bull to the bear side." Again, Mr. Livermore. The New York Evening Post, February 16, 1924, says, "After a period of irregularity, the markets finally have entered on the sharpest reaction since the upward movement began last November. The reaction generally being attributed to rumors of a change in position by the trader, who has been the leader of the bull party. Its significance should perhaps be accepted with reserve. Under the circumstances, it would not be surprising if certain traders decided to let someone else carry a part of their stocks for a while, possibly with an eye to buying them back cheaper later on." According to the veteran financial editors of the 2 most important financial pages in New York, Mr. Livermore's signal was sufficient to cause the market to go up or down. The bull market following the election of President Coolidge was one of the most remarkable in the history of the stock exchange. It was greeted by newspaper writers with hallelujahs of praise and wonder. Here at last was an honest, unmanipulated bull market. It was the voice of the country, of its businessmen, registering satisfaction with the political situation. The influence of mind upon mind is apparent not only in such undulations of price as have just been pointed out, but also in those major cycles that last for months or even years and are known as booms, depressions, and crises. There have been crises in the United States during the last 35 years. In 1890, 1893, 1903, 1912, 1920. They have been commonly regarded as beyond human control, like the periodicity of the seasons or of sunspots. Nevertheless, crises are fundamentally psychological. The phases of the business cycle, prosperity and depression, are projections upon the business world of states of mind. Booms result from the vision by multitudes of businessmen of endlessly swelling profits. Panics from the sudden invasion of this hectic paradise by fear. In the technical language of economics, the boom is due to the overcapitalization of prospective profits. There is a rhythmic miscalculation of rents and of capital value, and the crisis or panic is the forcible and sudden movement of readjustment in the mistaken capitalization of productive agents. In short, panics follow from massed erroneous guessing. The disastrousness of these errors of judgment follows from the fact that not only speculation but all business is more or less conducted on credit, that is, practically on margin, and the pyramid of credit is reared upon the foundation of exaggerated expectations of profits. The success or failure of a man engaged in manufacturing, or in transportation, or in agriculture depends more upon his skill as a prophet than upon his industry as a producer. Much more does the success or failure of the merchant depend upon his guessing ability. The outstanding feature of booms, crises, panics, and depressions is their apparent irresistibility. All stand by helplessly, knowing that there is something absurd in the spectacle, yet unable to stop it. The uprush of business is usually initiated by some stimulus to men's imaginations. The discovery of new wealth, such as oil or gold, the opening of new markets, an extraordinary wheat crop, the conclusion of a war. Once having started, the continual rise of prices acts as a colossal suggestion upon buyers and sellers. All are under the spell, demanding higher prices and paying them. Finally, someone does become skeptical. The doubt spreads, and there is a wild rush to unload. Now, although it is impossible for any individual or group to reverse the tide of inflation when it is running strong, is it not possible for a group advantageously situated to give the signal that will hasten, if only by a month or two, the inevitable change from flood to ebb? Professors Thorstein Veblen and Wesley C. Mitchell believe that the coteries of financiers that control the large banks of New York are in such a position. The advantage enjoyed by this small group of major financiers, writes Mitchell, is not limited to superior opportunities for foreseeing approaching changes. In a measure, they can control the events they forecast. Two things are clear. One is the motive, as they say in murder cases. The more the inside mechanism of business is revealed, the more certain it becomes that the number of men who are in business for anything but business is negligible. The other is the opportunity. A push to the credit system, such as has been suggested, might be delivered in the form of an opinion emanating from the head of one of the international banking houses in New York, or from the president of the United States Steel Corporation. But louder than words speaks action. The meaning of an actual restriction of loans or of the raising of the rate of interest is immediately understood. If they lock up large sums of money, they reduce the reserves of banks and precipitate the downward revision of credits with which a crisis begins. If they prevent corporations from raising loans needed to meet maturing obligations, they force the appointment of receivers, beat down the price of stocks, and create a sentiment of distrust which produces further consequences of its own. Crowds are subject to stampede from fright or ecstasy. These movements may result from the summation of many small impulses, or they may be started by a scientifically planned series of blows, rumors from well-informed quarters, statements from official sources, leaks from Washington, and by those familiar devices for arousing imitation known as rigging the market. By close observance of the laws of mob psychology, the market operator or the pool with powerful resources is enabled to initiate movements of which the foreordained consequences are incoming tides of gold. From the simple duel between buyer and seller in a retail shop to the complex operations of a crisis, business consists largely of efforts at persuasion. The semi-rural shopkeeper sits patiently waiting for customers. The modern merchant herds them into his store. The difference in their methods measures the progress in the technique of controlling behavior. Everywhere in business, we see individuals engaged in laboring to influence the minds of others, sometimes by means of logical argument, but more often by indirect appeals to the subconscious, to massed instincts, and to that curious susceptibility to mob contagion that is just beginning to be understood. The bulls try to communicate their bullishness, the bears their bearishness. Business is the sum total of this bluffing and higgling, this cajolery, deception, intimidation, propaganda, and persuasion.